What occurs when a conceited flight attendant, fixated on status and authority, attempts to belittle a reserved passenger in a shabby jacket on a private jet, only to realize she's dealing with Keanu Reeves himself? You won't believe how this flight concludes. Before we proceed with this tale, let us know where you're tuning in from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel because tomorrow we have another special story for you. The private jet sat on the lit runway, awaiting its exclusive travelers. The sky, painted in hues of orange and purple by the setting sun, added a cinematic touch to the scene. Elegantly dressed men and women strolled across the red carpet leading to the aircraft entrance, their smug smiles, expensive fragrances, and confident strides revealing their elite status. Amidst this display of luxury, a man in a simple coat and worn backpack ascended the metal stairs without drawing attention. His shoulders were relaxed, his steps measured, and his expression calm, almost detached. With slightly messy dark hair and an unshaven beard, he seemed out of place among these polished figures. Keanu Reeves walked down the spacious aisle, discreetly observing the cabin. Beige leather seats, minimalist chandeliers, and even a small bar on the side composed the refined environment. The other passengers were already seated, engaged in superficial conversations about business investments and their latest extravagant acquisitions. Flight attendant Jack Wayne, impeccably dressed, conducted her usual assessment of the passengers. With years of experience on private flights, she had developed a keen instinct for recognizing who was who on board. Her sharp eyes scanned the cabin, evaluating each person based on appearance and posture. When her gaze landed on Keanu, she frowned slightly. Something didn't fit: the worn-out coat, the old backpack slung over his shoulder. He definitely didn't look like someone who belonged there. She watched as he settled into one of the spacious seats, gazing out the window with the serenity of someone used to traveling, but something felt off. Jacqueline approached another flight attendant and whispered, unable to hide her suspicion, "Are you sure they checked the passenger list?" Her colleague looked at her, surprised. "Of course, he's on the list." She cast another critical look at Keanu, biting her lower lip. Maybe he was an assistant to someone important, a personal aide to a tycoon. Keanu, in turn, noticed the flight attendant's suspicious gaze. His dark eyes met hers briefly, and he simply smiled faintly, saying nothing. The engines purred softly as the aircraft door closed and the cabin prepared for takeoff. Jacqueline followed her usual protocol, ensuring all passengers were comfortable. She offered champagne to a pair of business people in the front row, then moved on to another group of excited investors. But when she passed Keanu, she pretended not to see him. He didn't react. He only tilted his head slightly, as if finding the situation amusing. The plane gained speed on the runway, and within seconds, it was airborne, leaving the city behind. Jacqueline stole another discreet glance at Keanu. She still didn't understand what this man was doing there. Little did she know that this silent, seemingly ordinary passenger was about to change her life forever. Jacqueline's eyes narrowed. What is this guy doing here? Little did she know that this simple passenger was about to change her life forever. The plane glided smoothly through the sky as the passengers settled comfortably into their luxurious seats. The in-flight service had begun, and Jacqueline, as always, maintained her impeccable posture. She moved gracefully down the aisle, holding a bottle of expensive champagne, filling the glasses of the most important passengers. The clinking of crystal and hushed laughter blended with the ambient hum of the flight. When she reached the row where Keanu was seated, her gaze passed right over him as if he were invisible. She didn't even bother to offer him a drink. Keanu watched the scene calmly. He didn't seem surprised, let alone offended. He simply folded his hands in his lap and waited. She didn't just ignore him. She made a point of showing that he didn't belong in that environment. Taking advantage of a moment when she passed by him, Jacqueline decided to take another step in putting him in his proper place. She stopped beside Keanu's seat and, in a professional but slightly condescending tone, said, "Sir, this area is reserved for exclusive clients. There are available seats in the back of the cabin." Keanu lifted his gaze to her, his face calm, but his eyes seemed to see beyond the surface. "I'm fine here, thank you." His response was firm, but without any trace of confrontation. That irritated Jacqueline. She was used to passengers who simply obeyed her instructions without question. For a moment, she hesitated. But then she decided it wasn't worth insisting and moved away, muttering something inaudible to the other passengers. The businessman who'd been watching the scene now followed everything with even greater interest. He noticed Keanu's composed demeanor and the way he handled the disdain without reacting, without retaliating. This made him frown once more. A few minutes later, Jacqueline returned, pushing the beverage cart down the aisle. Her expression was impassive, but inside, her patience was wearing thin. As she passed by Keanu, he shifted slightly, unaware that his shoulder would lightly brush against the cart. It was almost an imperceptible contact, but Jacqueline saw an opportunity. With a quick motion, she tilted one of the bottles on the cart, spilling an entire glass of ice water over Keanu. The liquid soaked his coat and part of his shirt. A collective gasp swept through the cabin. "Oh, what a clumsy mistake," Jacqueline said in a falsely apologetic tone, though a small, satisfied smirk lingered at the corner of her lips. All eyes were now on Keanu. He looked down at his wet clothes, took a deep breath, and then lifted his gaze to Jacqueline. He said nothing. He just stared at her. But there was something in the way he looked at her, a firm, intense gaze that sent a chill down the flight attendant's spine. Perhaps because of the discomfort of his stare, or maybe out of frustration that someone like him refused to feel inferior, Jacqueline crossed her arms and said louder than necessary, "You're a fraud. You don't even belong here." The nearby passengers stopped their conversations. The businessman furrowed his brows even deeper. "I've seen this before," Jacqueline continued, her expression full of disdain. "People who don't belong to this lifestyle trying to fit in, they think they can fool others for a while, but they're always exposed in the end." She tilted her head, analyzing him as if inspecting a defective product. "Are you even American?" Silence filled the cabin. Keanu remained still, his gaze fixed on her, but something in the atmosphere shifted. The businessman watching him raised an eyebrow. He was about to say something when he noticed that Keanu had not yet reacted, and that was when Jacqueline, for the first time, felt a flicker of regret creep up her spine. The way he looked at her, it wasn't anger, it wasn't humiliation. It was as if he already knew exactly what was about to happen next. Keanu looked at his wet clothes, then raised his eyes to Jacqueline. He said nothing, but the way he stared at her sent a chill down her spine. Silence hung in the cabin like a razor's edge, ready to cut. All eyes were on Keanu and Jacqueline. The passengers around them barely dared to breathe, sensing that something was about to unfold. Jacqueline stood with her arms crossed, her lips pressed tightly together. She was expecting a reaction, an explanation, maybe even an apology. But Keanu said nothing. He just watched her. That irritated her more than any response would have. "Are you just going to stare at me? Don't you have anything to say?" Her voice was sharp, almost taunting. Keanu tilted his head slightly, as if analyzing the situation from a different angle. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried weight. "It's funny. You look at me and see a fraud, but I look at you and see someone trying to convince themselves that they truly belong here." Jacqueline's brow furrowed, caught off guard by his words. Keanu continued, "I've met a lot of people like you. People who think that wearing an expensive uniform, walking these aisles with perfect posture, and stepping on others will make them part of something bigger. But do you know what happens when the uniform comes off, when the door closes, and the plane lands? You're still just you." A heavy silence filled the cabin. The businessman who'd been watching crossed his arms, intrigued. Some socialites in the front row exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one was more affected than Jacqueline. She opened her mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Then Keanu added, "The problem isn't me sitting in the seat. The problem is that you're afraid that at the end of the day, there's no seat reserved for you in this game." It was as if he had pulled the ground from under her. Jacqueline felt her face heat up. The anger rising in her throat wasn't just because of Keanu's audacity. It was because, deep down, his words had struck exactly where it hurt. "Shut up," she snapped, and then, without thinking, she raised her hand and slapped him across the face. The sharp sound echoed through the cabin. The muffled laughter from before turned into murmurs of shock. Some passengers' mouths fell open in disbelief. Keanu's face turned slightly with the impact, but he didn't react right away. He ran his tongue over the corner of his mouth, tasting a faint trace of blood from a small cut. Then slowly, he turned his gaze back to Jacqueline. Keanu Reeves sat quietly, his face slightly turned from the impact of the slap, yet his expression remained unchanged. There was no anger or surprise in his eyes, only a calm certainty, as if everything had been predetermined. Jacqueline, who had felt in control moments before, now felt her stomach churn, unsure of how to react. A socialite in the front row widened her eyes, recognizing him, but before she could speak, a passenger began recording the scene. The sound of the slap lingered like thunder, and the surrounding passengers were in shock, some holding their breath, others staring in disbelief. The pilot emerged from the cockpit, his expression darkening as he took in the scene and noticed the redness on Keanu's cheek. "What happened here?" he demanded, his voice authoritative. Jacqueline, trying to regain her composure, responded arrogantly, "A passenger who doesn't know his place." The pilot's face hardened. "Do you even know who you're talking about?" he asked incredulously. Jacqueline crossed her arms defiantly. "Honestly, I don't care. If he's causing trouble, he should be removed." The cabin fell silent as the pilot chuckled dryly, then turned to Keanu, removing his cap in a gesture of respect. "This is Keanu Reeves, and he owns this airline," he announced, shattering the mystery. The cabin erupted in murmurs of shock and recognition. Jacqueline froze, her face pale, as the reality of her actions sank in. Social media was about to explode with the unfolding drama. Keanu remained composed, nodding slightly at the pilot. "Thank you for stepping in, but I think it's clear what happened here," he said calmly. Jacqueline's attempt to humiliate him had backfired, leaving her humiliated instead. Her heart pounded as she tried to justify herself, but there was nothing left to say. The businessman who had been observing the scene smirked. "Well, now this just got interesting." The murmurs grew louder, and phones continued to record. Jacqueline felt her heart race as she searched for some defense, but all she found was judgment. Keanu watched her silently, his lack of reaction more unsettling than any outburst. The pilot addressed Jacqueline sternly. "Do you have anything to say?" She stammered, "I didn't know," her voice barely audible. The pilot raised an eyebrow. "And if you had known, would you have treated him differently?" The silence was overwhelming. Jacqueline wanted to respond, but no excuse could change what had happened. The realization that her facade had crumbled terrified her. The passengers' once indifferent gazes were now disapproving, and the phones captured every moment of her discomfort. Keanu's calm demeanor was the most unnerving of all. He reached for his phone, typed something, and placed it back on the armrest, ignoring Jacqueline's panicked inquiry. The pilot announced an unscheduled landing, and Jacqueline felt the ground disappear beneath her. "No, wait, please," she pleaded, but no one listened. The passengers returned to their seats, and Keanu continued to gaze out the window, unfazed. Agents escorted Jacqueline off the plane, her pleas ignored. As she passed Keanu, she made a final desperate attempt. "Mr. Reeves, I made a mistake. I was stressed. I didn't know who you were." Keanu turned to her, the cabin holding its breath. "You didn't need to know who I am. You just needed to know how to treat people," he said calmly. The words hit her like a hammer. Jacqueline had no arguments left. Keanu turned back to the window. The chapter closed for him. The agents led her away, and as she descended the plane's stairs, the full weight of reality hit her. Her job was gone, her reputation destroyed. She looked back at the plane, but the door was already closing. Inside, Keanu continued his journey, the incident nothing more than a brief turbulence. The plane landed, and passengers disembarked, still processing the events. Jacqueline's story spread rapidly on social media, the video of the slap and her humiliation going viral. Keanu, however, remained unconcerned, walking through the terminal with his backpack, just another traveler in the crowd. Journalists approached him, asking for a comment on the incident. Keanu paused, then replied, "People often confuse luxury with money, but true luxury isn't how we treat each other." His words resonated, and the interview went viral. The hashtag #luxury is respect trended worldwide. Jacqueline's dismissal was announced, her face plastered across news sites. Any hope of a fresh start seemed impossible. Meanwhile, Keanu's message became a symbol of something greater. In a world where power and money often dominated, he showed that true greatness lies in how we treat others. As social media continued to debate the incident, Keanu was ready for his next flight, living his life without needing to prove anything to anyone. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience. Thank you for watching. If you missed our last story, don't worry, I've got you covered. I'll leave it here for you to watch. Hope you enjoy it. In the world of glitter and glam, some people go to extraordinary lengths to secure their place in the spotlight. And on a particularly memorable evening, one influencer's obsession with status and social media fame led her into a confrontation that would not only backfire, but change her life forever. What happens when a spoiled influencer, known for her lavish lifestyle and million-strong following, decides to humiliate a quiet, unassuming man in a hoodie at one of Los Angeles' most exclusive restaurants? The outcome is as shocking as it is unforgettable, and trust me, you'll never see it coming. Before we dive deeper into this jaw-dropping story, why not take a moment to tell us where you're tuning in from? If you're loving this tale, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow, we've got something even more special lined up. Picture this. It's 7 p.m. in Los Angeles, and the city is alive with the scent of fresh truffles and the sparkle of imported champagne. The parking lot outside Cheesepacca is an automotive runway, lined with sleek luxury cars that look as if they've been straight off the pages of a fashion magazine. The valet is busy ushering millionaires and celebrities from their cars, and the air practically hums with wealth. Inside, the restaurant is a sanctuary of sophistication. Crystal chandeliers cast golden light over pristine linen tablecloths, and waiters glide through the space with the precision of dancers, carrying plates that look like true works of culinary art. Cheesepacca isn't just a place to eat. It's a symbol of exclusivity. Its clientele is handpicked, and every single table is reserved for those whose last names hold more power than most could ever dream of. It's a place where the ordinary person simply doesn't belong. Or, at least, that's how it was supposed to stay. Then, the door swung open with a flourish. OMG, guys, you won't believe where I am right now. The sharp, theatrical voice of Addison Deo, better known to her millions of followers as Addison, cut through the ambience. Holding her phone high, she beamed at the camera with a perfectly rehearsed smile, clearly used to being the center of attention. Addison wasn't just a social media star. She was an institution. With over 3 million followers and a reputation for flaunting the high life, she knew how to stir the pot. As she strolled into Cheesepacca, the air around her practically crackled with the kind of self-assuredness that comes only from a deep belief in one's own magnificence. "I'm at Cheesepacca, the most exclusive restaurant in LA," she announced dramatically, her phone capturing her every move. "I always get what I want, always." She strutted through the restaurant like she owned it, draped in a shimmering dress that clung to her like a second skin, her platinum black hair cascading in perfect waves, and her makeup, though impeccable, gave off an almost artificial vibe. Her eyes scanned the room, looking for signs of admiration or recognition. But to her surprise, the other diners were mostly too engrossed in their own meals to even glance her way. "Guys, do you have any idea how much it costs to eat here?" Addison continued, her voice dripping with theatricality. "The cheapest dish must be worth my personal trainer's rent." She laughed, and her followers flooded the comments section with responses like, "Haha, Addison being Addison," and "OMG, I love this chaos, keep going, queen." Satisfied with the attention, she leaned back in her seat and scanned the room with a look of barely concealed disdain, clearly expecting more of the same adoration she was used to receiving online. "Luxury, am I right?" Addison said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "I swear, places like this need to live up to the hype, or I'm going to expose them in my stories. I've seen better food at a cafeteria." Her followers, always ready for a dose of drama, encouraged her every step of the way. "Yes, expose them, queen." One wrote, "Love when you do these raw, honest reviews." Another comment read, I can just imagine the peasants gasping right now. But then, something unexpected happened. Something that would completely derail her self-absorbed performance and alter the course of her night. In the quietest corner of the room, at a table so unobtrusive it was almost invisible, sat a man. He wore a simple dark blue hoodie, and unlike the other diners who were dressed to the nines, he seemed out of place. His head was lowered as he ate slowly, seemingly indifferent to the glitzy world around him. He wasn't posing for photos or casting glances, nor was he trying to make an impression. He was simply there, eating his meal in peace, lost in his own little world. This man didn't appear to care about the flashing cameras, the luxury, or the social media circus unfolding at the other end of the room. To Addison, he seemed like a perfect candidate for ridicule. Her followers began to notice, and the comments started to flood in. "OMG, who's that guy behind you? He looks so familiar," one follower posted. "Wait, is that? No way." But Addison, too caught up in her own performance, didn't yet realize the significance of this random man. She was oblivious to the fact that she had just captured the attention of someone who would completely change the trajectory of her night. And worse, she was about to make the worst mistake of her life. Addison, focused solely on her live stream, swiped her finger across the screen to adjust her angle. Her fingers paused for a moment as she frowned. Something was off. No matter how she adjusted her position, that man in the blue hoodie was still in the shot. The comments grew louder. "That guy in the background is so out of place. He's just sitting there like a total weirdo." Addison's frustration began to show. "Ugh, I can't get this right. He's totally messing up my vibe," she muttered to herself, her voice tinged with annoyance. With a forced, sugar-sweet smile plastered on her face, she got up and made her way toward the man. Her phone was still held high, broadcasting the whole exchange to her millions of followers. "Hey there, sir," she cooed, her voice now dripping with false politeness. "Would you mind moving out of my shot? I need a more aesthetic background for my video." The man didn't respond immediately. His eyes remained lowered, still lost in his meal, completely unaware that he was about to become the target of her ridicule. What Addison didn't know, though, was that the man sitting there wasn't just any regular diner. He wasn't just an unimportant background character in her Instagram story. And at that very moment, he was about to show her that sometimes, it's not the loudest voices that deserve the spotlight. But I bet you're wondering, who was this man? Why was he so unfazed by her outburst? And most importantly, how would this whole drama unfold? The truth is, the man Addison was trying to humiliate wasn't just any ordinary person. In fact, he was someone she could never have imagined. A person who was about to flip the entire situation on its head. Stay tuned, because the real twist is just about to begin. The man slowly lifted his eyes, locking his gaze with hers. His expression was calm, unbothered, like he had just stepped out of the quietest of rooms. He blinked once, then again, and after setting his fork down delicately, he wiped the corners of his mouth with his napkin. As he did so, a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips, and the words he spoke next hit her like a thunderclap. "The real world doesn't have filters, Mississippi." Addison froze. The comments section on her live stream exploded in an instant, flashing on her screen faster than she could process them. "What? Did he just throw shade at her?" one comment read. "Who is this guy? I like him." Another one chimed in. Addison blinked a few times, caught completely off guard. What was this guy even talking about? He wasn't playing along with the show, the spectacle she had carefully curated for her millions of followers. She let out a nervous, breathy laugh, her usual cool evaporating. Yeah, sure," she stammered, trying to regain control. "But this is an important live stream, you know?" She pointed at her phone as if she needed to explain something as obvious as the air they were both breathing. The man didn't respond. He simply shrugged and returned to his meal, tearing a piece of bread with an unhurried, almost deliberate pace. The silence between them was thick, charged with an energy that made Addison feel a slight heat creeping up her face. Something wasn't right. Around the restaurant, the first few patrons started to notice the small exchange. Glances were exchanged, murmurs rose. For the first time in the evening, Addison felt a weight she had never had to carry before. The feeling that she was losing control of the situation. The bright lights of her live stream, the world she usually dominated, suddenly seemed far away. She crossed her arms defensively, trying to mask the unease that was starting to build within her. "Oh, I get it," she said, her voice dripping with feigned sarcasm. "You want attention, right?" She rolled her eyes, her smile a little too wide, a little too forced. "I totally support that, sir, but there are way cooler ways to go about it." The man remained completely unfazed. His focus was entirely on his meal, as if the drama unfolding in front of him was nothing more than background noise. Irritation began to knot in Addison's chest. This wasn't going according to plan. She needed to steer this conversation back to where it belonged. In her hands, she took a deep breath, steeling herself. "Anyway, guys," she said, her voice suddenly bright and rehearsed again. "I try to be polite, but some people just don't understand the concept of collaboration, right?" The comments exploded again, but this time, there was a noticeable shift in tone. "Haha, this guy's iconic," one comment said. "He just owned you with class." Another read, "Addison, you're being a bit harsh, don't you think?" For the first time in her career, Addison realized she wasn't 100% in control of the narrative anymore. The man in the dark blue hoodie, sitting there so calmly and so indifferent to the game she was playing, had turned the tables on her in a way she hadn't seen coming. Worse still, he didn't care at all. His relaxed demeanor was ruining everything she had worked so hard to build. Nearby tables were now whispering. Patrons were sneaking glances, trying to piece together what exactly was going on. And though Addison could feel their eyes on her, she refused to back down. No way. She couldn't show weakness. Turning back to the man, she kept her voice steady but strained. "Seriously, can't you just, I don't know, move to another table? It'll be quick." He raised an eyebrow, staring at her for a beat. "I like this table." That was the final straw. Addison's patience snapped. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in deep, mentally counting to 3. When she opened them again, her gaze was razor-sharp, her voice dripping with thinly veiled disdain. "Sir, I don't know if you've noticed, but this is a high-end restaurant," she said, her tone carrying a venomous edge. "The least we expect here is a little self-awareness." The man simply smiled, finishing his bite of food at his own leisurely pace. "Self-awareness," he repeated, as if savoring the word on his tongue. Addison scoffed. "Exactly." She shifted on her feet, suddenly adopting an air of faux compassion, turning back to the camera. "Since you seem so comfortable here, I'll give you some free advice. Have you ever heard of energy? High vibrations? This place is all about maintaining a high frequency, you know? And honestly, sir," she paused, a smile curving up at the corners of her lips, "you seem kind of drained. Maybe a salt bath would help." Silence fell over the restaurant like a heavy curtain. Addison's words hung in the air, and the reaction was swift. Her followers, usually eager to back her every move, weren't so sure this time. The comments were now filled with awkward laughter and secondhand embarrassment. "Oof, that was kind of weird," one comment said. "Addison, I think you went a bit too far," another added. Yikes. But Addison, ever the performer, thought she had one. She was still convinced that she was in control. "What?" she said, brushing it off. "It's not a big deal, guys. Who hasn't messed around a little?" She turned back to the man, flashing a forced, dazzling smile. But something was off. The chat took an unexpected turn. "Wait, I think I know that guy. OMG, no way, Addison. Get out of there before it's too late." Addison frowned, completely confused. What were her followers talking about? She quickly scrolled through the comments, her fingers racing across the screen. Her stomach sank as the truth hit her like a freight train. She recognized the name now. The man in the dark blue hoodie was none other than Keanu Reeves. Keanu Reeves. The Keanu Reeves. A living legend. One of the most beloved actors in Hollywood. A man known not just for his unparalleled talent, but for his down-to-earth personality and kind heart. The same man she had just humiliated in front of millions of people. Her blood turned cold. Her face went pale. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. It couldn't be him. There was no way. But as her gaze flicked back to the man sitting across from her, his serene expression felt all too familiar now. The entire restaurant had caught on. Patrons were whispering in hushed tones. Phones were coming out to record the scene. And Addison's carefully constructed world was moments away from crumbling to dust. Trying to save face, she forced a laugh, though it felt hollow and uncomfortable in her throat. "Oh, come on, guys. You're overreacting. Of course I know who he is. Keanu's a cool actor and all, but like, no one's untouchable, right?" Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't react. He simply stared at her, calm and unbothered. The silence stretched out, thick with the weight of everything she had just done. He didn't need to say a word to have the room's attention. His presence was overwhelming, his calmness disarming, and somehow that made Addison feel smaller than she ever had before. Desperate to flip the narrative, she turned back to her camera. "Guys, seriously, it's not a big deal. Who hasn't messed around a little, right?" Her voice trembled, but she tried to sound confident. And then, in the silence of that restaurant, Keanu Reeves finally spoke. He placed his napkin on the table, looked her directly in the eyes, and said the words that would destroy her. "Why don't you just leave me alone, Addison?" Addison's face drained of color. The final curtain had dropped, and her fall from grace had just begun. Addison Lux stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat, as she faced Keanu Reeves, the man who had just shattered her carefully constructed world. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted, a palpable tension filling the air. The waiters had come to a halt, their movements suspended in mid-action. The patrons, once absorbed in their own meals, were now sitting on the edge of their seats, eyes glued to the unfolding drama. The unmistakable sound of smartphones being lifted filled the room, each camera poised to capture the spectacle. Keanu Reeves, undeterred by the scene, calmly placed his napkin on the table, his movements deliberate, as if time itself had slowed down around him. He then looked up at Addison, his gaze unwavering, a quiet kind of devastation in his eyes. It wasn't anger nor irritation that radiated from him. It was something more profound, compassion, not pity, but a somber understanding, as though he was witnessing a tragic inevitability. And then, in the calmest, most measured voice imaginable, Keanu spoke the words that would haunt Addison for the rest of her life. "You know, I never had to beg for attention online to feel relevant." The words cut through the air like a blade, silencing the room. The entire restaurant froze. The laughter, the murmurs, everything stopped. For a brief moment, it felt as though the world held its breath. Addison's smile, once confident and assured, faltered and stiffened on her face. She had no comeback. The words had landed with surgical precision, rendering her speechless. The live chat on her phone exploded into chaos, but Addison was too stunned to react. Her fingers shook as she read the comments, the flood of messages tumbling over each other. There was no defending herself now. Keanu took a slow sip of his wine, not a single glance toward the camera, as if the entire situation were beneath him. Or perhaps it simply didn't matter to him. To Keanu, it was just another moment in a life he had mastered, untouched by the antics of the online world. But to Addison, it was everything. This was the moment that unraveled her. The moment when the veil of control she had so carefully draped over her life was torn apart in an instant. Her face flushed with embarrassment. She couldn't let it stand. She had to respond. She had to regain control, to defend herself, to prove that she was still in charge. But the rage that simmered beneath the surface was now rising, and with it came the familiar sting of shame. How had it come to this? "Oh, great," she sneered, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and panic. "Now you're going to hit me with some deep wisdom? Who do you think you are?" Her voice shook, and she could feel the eyes of every person in the room on her. The patrons, the staff, they were all watching, and for the first time in her career, Addison felt the overwhelming weight of judgment. The whispers began, subtle at first, but growing louder as the realization spread through the restaurant. People were turning to each other, exchanging knowing glances. Some were recording, others were typing frantically into their phones. For a brief, fleeting moment, Addison saw the truth. She was no longer the queen of her live stream, the charismatic influencer who controlled every narrative. She was alone. The people she had once commanded with her charm were now distant, no longer on her side. But Addison wasn't ready to concede just yet. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and tried again. "You might be famous, Keanu Reeves," she said, her voice forced, "but I'm the new generation." She turned toward the camera, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "People like him are over. This is the future. And if he doesn't get it, that's his loss." A heavy silence descended on the restaurant. And then, Keanu chuckled. It was low, almost inaudible, but it cut through the tension like a knife. The sound of it echoed in the room, and it was enough to make Addison's stomach churn. It wasn't mocking, not at all. It was something else, something far worse. Keanu lifted his gaze again, that small, knowing smile still tugging at his lips. And then he spoke, his words once again hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. "The problem with the new generation isn't the future they create," he said, his voice steady and unwavering. "It's the emptiness they leave behind." Boom. The words landed like a thunderclap, shaking the foundation of everything Addison thought she knew. Gasps rippled through the room. The live chat on her phone went into overdrive, the comments now overwhelmingly in Keanu's favor. Addison's heart raced. She had no response, no retort. She had been beaten, not just in the argument, but in every sense of the word. Her carefully curated image, her carefully constructed world, was crumbling around her. The fury that had built up inside Addison now exploded. Her face was hot with humiliation, and her hands clenched into fists, trembling with rage. She couldn't back down. She wouldn't. She was Addison Lux. She couldn't lose like this. In a desperate, almost instinctual move, Addison swung her fist toward Keanu. The strike was fast, fueled by hatred, by the desperate need to regain control of a situation that was slipping through her fingers. But Keanu didn't flinch. He didn't even move. He simply raised one hand, and in one smooth motion, he caught her wrist mid-air. Addison's heart stopped. Her arm trembled, and for a moment, she couldn't pull away. His grip was firm, but it wasn't aggressive. It wasn't violent. It was just unyielding. Keanu held her wrist with the kind of quiet strength that left her powerless to do anything but stare into his eyes. His expression held no anger, no malice, just pity. Pity for the woman who had built her life on arrogance and shallow validation. And that was when it hit her. The realization, sharp and cold, pierced her heart. The rage drained from her, leaving only a deep, searing shame. The illusion of control she had lived with for so long shattered in that moment. She was no longer in charge of the narrative. She was no longer the center of attention. In that one quiet, effortless gesture, Keanu had stripped her of everything. Without a word, he released her wrist, his eyes never leaving hers. Addison's hand hung limp at her side, the weight of what had just happened crashing down on her. She staggered backward, her heels slipping on the polished floor, and for a brief moment, her phone wobbled dangerously in her hand. Keanu sighed, his gaze returning to his meal, completely indifferent to the chaos he had just caused. He took a final sip of his wine and resumed eating, as if nothing had happened. But for Addison, the world had just ended. The restaurant erupted in laughter. It wasn't cruel, not exactly. It was a release, a collective exhale as the tension broke. The sound of it was deafening. But for Addison, it was the sound of her humiliation being sealed, immortalized in real time. Phones were recording every second, and the comments on her live stream were now an uncontrollable avalanche of mockery and scorn. She couldn't take it anymore. Her face was burning, her pride in tatters. She needed to escape, but before she could take a single step, the voice of the restaurant manager sliced through the air, sharp and unwavering. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the restaurant immediately," he said, his expression cold, his stance unyielding. Addison's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced. "You're joking, right?" she said, a nervous laugh escaping her lips. "Do you know who I am?" The manager didn't blink. Here at Cheese Spacca, We value respect and the experience of our guests. And you, miss, clearly do not meet that standard." Addison felt her face burn with humiliation, but she was beyond caring. She looked around, expecting someone to defend her, to stand up for her. But no one did. The guests stared back at her blankly, their expressions neutral. Some even seemed to take satisfaction in the situation. And then, it hit her. She was utterly alone. "This is ridiculous," she exploded, crossing her arms. "I'm going to cancel this restaurant. You're all screwed. My followers will destroy you." Keanu, still sitting calmly at his table, didn't even look up. He merely gave her a faint, knowing smile. "Are you sure?" he murmured, taking another sip of his wine. Addison's stomach dropped. She turned toward her phone, her fingers trembling as she tried to find some support. But the comments had changed. They were no longer on her side. "Girl, I think you already lost this battle. Addison, stop embarrassing yourself. This is painful to watch. Read the room, woman. You messed with the wrong guy." Her heart sank. It was over. She had lost not just the argument, not just control of the narrative, but her entire identity. The manager's cold words sealed her fate. "Our staff will escort you to the exit." Addison's world collapsed. She had no choice. With a last, furious glance at the restaurant, she turned and marched toward the exit, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. She was furious, defeated, and utterly broken. As she stepped through the door, the entire restaurant erupted into applause. It wasn't forced. It wasn't out of cruelty. It was relief. And in the midst of it all, Keanu Reeves simply went back to eating, as though nothing had happened. For him, it hadn't. But for Addison, this was the beginning of her worst nightmare. And little did she know, her downfall was only just beginning. As she climbed into her car, trembling with rage, she pulled out her phone, her live stream still running. 4.3 million people were watching. But the comments weren't the same. The support she had expected was nowhere to be found. The memes started soon after, flooding the internet. Her face, frozen in shock, became the perfect symbol of her downfall. The captions were merciless. "When you pick a fight with the wrong person, no filter can fix this. High vibrations? More like high delusions." But the worst was yet to come. The emails started arriving. The entire world was talking about what had happened. Addison Lux's public humiliation had become one of the most talked about moments on the internet. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone had a joke. But the one thing that made her burn with shame more than anything else was that Keanu Reeves never said a word about it. He didn't need to. And that, more than anything else, destroyed her. She wanted him to react, to give an interview, to acknowledge her existence. But he never did. And in that silence, Addison understood that her battle had already been lost. Keanu Reeves simply carried on with his life, unfazed by the chaos that exploded across social media. While the virtual world watched Addison Lux's empire crumble, he strolled peacefully through the streets of Los Angeles, sipping coffee at a quiet cafe, riding his motorcycle, and living as if the public collapse of her world was the least of his concerns. The best response he could offer was, in fact, no response at all. Silence. His indifference was his most powerful statement, a quiet testament to the fact that those who truly matter don't need to shout for attention. By the end of the week, a journalist managed to slip into Chi Spacca, gaining access to the restaurant's guest book. Flipping through its pages, the journalist paused at a signature that caught his eye: Keanu Reeves. Beneath his name, written in elegant, simple handwriting, was a short but impactful message in black ink. True influence isn't measured by what you flaunt, but by what you share with the world. The photo of the message was snapped, posted online, and, of course, went viral. The world went wild, sharing the profound words of a man who had silently defeated Addison with nothing more than his calm demeanor. Meanwhile, Addison, sitting alone in the darkness of her apartment, watched everything unfold in real time. The empire she had built from nothing had crumbled before her eyes. Sponsors disappeared. Partnerships evaporated. Her engagement plummeted. Admiration turned to ridicule. And out there, Keanu Reeves continued his life, as quiet and unaffected as ever. He walked the streets of Los Angeles, dressed in a simple dark blue hoodie, unbothered by the noise around him. Because, to him, nothing had changed. He never asked for the spotlight. He never needed to defend himself. Those who are truly relevant don't need to prove anything to anyone. In the end, Addison Lux wasn't a real threat. She was just another person desperately trying to stay in the spotlight, to be remembered at any cost. In a world where so many shout for attention, Keanu reminded us that true respect is earned in silence. If you enjoyed this story, we have many more that will warm your heart. Click the screen to explore more stories of hope, compassion, and resilience.